In this presentation, we will start to enter cash outflows, checks, and other outflows from the bank statement into QuickBooks Register. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info. Here is our bank statement. Last time we took a look at the deposits. Now we're going to take a look at the outflows. And remember that the outflows could be checks, they could be electronic transfers, but typically we will have a bit more information in terms of who the vendors are, whether they be electronic transfer or check, and if checks, we'll have the check number as well, and the date, which isn't as useful as it could be because it won't line up with when the checks were written necessarily or be as close as, say, the deposits might be, but we will have the dates as well. We're going to enter this as of the dates here. So we're just going to start going through our list. Now, every time we hit a problem here, what we're going to do is try to push forward and continue with what we're doing and write down the problem or any questions we have in our open items list so that we can reconcile everything and then ask all the questions we need at the end of the process. So we want to do as much as we can to keep kind of pushing forward and move on and ask questions instead of running into a wall and stopping. And this is we will run into walls and stops here because we're going to have certain vendors, especially when it's the first month with a new client, that we're just not going to know who they are. And we'll have to do something for them in the meantime to move forward. So here's our open item list, and we have it ready to go for us to ask some questions about this information. So now we're just going to go from here and enter this data into QuickBooks. So first we have the vendor here, Epiphone. So that's going to be our first vendor. And again, right off the bat, we may not exactly even know who Epiphone is. So that might be a question just from the start, and we'll start there. Now, a lot of times if it's in if we're doing bookkeeping for someone we don't know or an industry we don't know, we could do some research, of course. For example, we can pull up good old Google here and type in Epiphone into Google and see if we can get some answers on what Epiphone is. And if we do that, we can get some references and say, Epiphone has something to do with guitars. Maybe they sell guitars. So possibly Epiphone, given the fact that the name of our company has to do with guitars, might be a vendor. So we might think that, okay, maybe Epiphone is someone who they buy from. So we might want to write that down in our open items as we go. When we ask the client, we might want to say, who is Epiphone? So we'll ask the customer, the client, who is Epiphone? Are they a vendor you purchase inventory from? And we'll list maybe the purchases. So on 4/1, it's saying 1/4, but on 4/1, the date, there's a check number 1,000 for $400 to Epiphone. So what is that? Once we know what that is, we can then say, okay, that'll be the same going forward typically. Now again, we're dealing with some customers that have inventory. And I'm going to tell you that this one's probably going to be an inventory item. So that could be different than if we were going to use this system. Most of the time, we would probably want to avoid clients that have a lot of inventory. But I'm just going to show inventory here just to give us a little bit more of a complicated case to see how we might deal with a more complicated case. Now we'll enter this into QuickBooks in our register. So if we open up the QuickBooks here, we've got the Open Windows open, or we're in the Home tab, and we have the Open Windows open. You can find at the View drop-down and Open Windows list. We're going to go to the register by going to banking and then go to use register. And then we're going to have the checking account should be the default. That's the one we want. So we're going to say okay. And then we're going to go into here and we're going to say the date is 0419. And this does have a check number. Now the first check number it's going to try to say is 1. We're starting at 01001. And this would start at whatever check number, we're using. If it's not the first time of operations, it probably won't be 1001. That's okay. It doesn't have to be the first check ever written here. But we're going to start at this point forward. Once we have that first number in, then the system will try to generate the next check numbers out. Now, this will give us an idea. If we were writing the checks within QuickBooks, we would always have the numbers in line. When we're not writing the checks and we're getting it from the bank, it'll give us an idea of those skipped checks. And those are kind of the areas that would be outstanding if there were outstanding items, or if we were tracking outstanding items. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So this is going to be Epiphone. So Epiphone. I'm going to say tab. Now, typically these are going to be vendors that we're going to set up, and typically we don't need a lot of information on it because we're just entering the data. We're just trying to get the data in there as quickly as possible. I'm not going to put the address, in other words, for all of this information. We're just going to use the quick add. So we'll quick add, and typically these will be vendors. So the default will be vendors in the register. That's a good guess in this case, so that's the one we're going to use. That means vendor for QuickBooks means who we owe money to or who we pay, typically who we buy stuff from. Like a store vendor. So we're going to say vendor, and then it's going to be in the payment section. It was for 400, and again, I'm thinking it was inventory, but I don't really know that. I'd like to confirm that. That's why we wrote the note. And if it is inventory, we'll have to think about what we're going to do with that because we have a couple different options. And for now, we're just going to put it into an account called uncategorized expense. So we'll just put it into, so I named it uncategorized expense, wrote it in there. You could also just say new account, but I like to type it in there and then say tab and then set up the new account. So we're going to set up this new account and it's going to be an expense and we're just going to call it uncategorized expense. That's all we need. This is going to be, again, our holding account, just like we had uncategorized income. And we could put a note. We'd probably be helpful for us to put notes in for our own purposes. We might say that we think this is inventory or something like that. But I'm going to leave it blank for now and just use it for our open items and say enter. Now, if we go to our reports, just to see what happens with that uncategorized income, I'm going to open up both reports, our main reports, the financial statements, balance sheet, and income statements by going to the reports drop down up top. Go into company and financial. I typically start with the balance sheet, so we'll open up the balance sheet. Then we're going to customize the report, changing the date to the dates we're working on, 01/01/19 to, I'm going to say 12/31/19 for the year here. So January 1st to December 31st, 2019 and okay. Now, of course, what we've done now is in the checking account. So if we were to double check on the checking account or zoom in, double click or zoom in, we have what's happening in the checking account. And here's our check 1001. Now, of course, we enter the deposits first, but it's in order by date here. If we were to double click on this item, it doesn't go to the check register. It goes to a check form. And this is what QuickBooks used to drive any kind of check. So although we enter it into the register, you got to get used to kind of the forms that QuickBooks will use. And these forms can be found, you can think about them if we go back to the home page in the open windows. You can think about them as going through here. So this is a check form that QuickBooks uses whenever we enter something that's like a check even into the register. So then we're going to go back here. I'm going to close that check out. I'm going to go back to the write checks, close that out in the open windows. So I'm in the open windows. I'm going to go back to the transaction account, close that out. So, and then we have the balance sheet, home tab, and the checking account only. Then we're going to go to the other side. So reports, we're going to go to company and financial and profit and loss. Profit and loss or income statement. This is the income statement. They call the profit and loss. Changing the dates to 01/01/19. 12/31/19. That's January 1st, 2019 to December 31st, 2019. And then here we have that uncategorized income or uncategorized expense. Like uncategorized income, we're going to have to go back in here and just recategorize these. Once we do this for the first month, we should be comfortable with it and be okay with doing it going forward and knowing whatever the new categorization should be. Double clicking on that, there's our check again. Double clicking on that, there's our information. Notice everything we enter into the register will in essence be a journal entry. It'll have two sides to it. Two accounts will be affected. One, of course, being the checking account because we're entering anything into the check register. So I'm going to close this back out, and we'll keep this open, and then we'll go back to the checking account and to the next transaction. So back to our bank, I'm going to say, okay, we entered that. Just going to highlight it, right click and highlight it. Next, we have a Gibson, and again, we may not know exactly what the Gibson is, so I'm going to have a similar note for the Gibson. So we'll pull up our open items here and put in a similar note. So we're going to say, who is Gibson? Are they a vendor you purchased inventory from? Same thing. We got the check number. The check number is 1002. So I'm going to delete this. Check number is 1002, and it's for $700. Now, doing this can be a little bit disheartening as we first start this off and we don't know who the vendors are, but once we do this for the first month, it'll get easier to do. So it's okay to go through this. It's better to be thorough in the first month and get the categorization correct so that we can then be correct going forward. So asking questions within the first month, good thing to do so that we have the foundations to move forward. So we'll enter this into our system then. So we're going to go back to QuickBooks and we'll enter this into our system as of the 7th. So I'm just going to play the plus until we get to 7. So there we are at January 7th, and now it's guessing the check number, and it's correct this time. And it should be fairly close because we should be somewhat in the realm, but we're not writing the checks from the system, so it's not going to be always right on. And the checks in the bank account may differ in order in terms of check number, meaning the check numbers may be out of order because the checking account here, the bank statement might be in order by check number, but it might be in order by date. And it's very possible that even though we wrote the checks in the same check number in order by date, or our client did, that they didn't clear in that order because it depends on when someone else is going to deposit the check. So it's quite possible that in our case, we put all the check numbers kind of in order, so they're cleared in order. We'll see some checks that will skip, however, where the check number will skip, because that for some reason that person didn't enter the check at all. And we'll see some check numbers that may be out of order if the checks are in order by date, meaning the withdrawals are in order by date, or the outflows are in order by date, not by check number. If the outflows are in order by check number, then the check numbers will be in order, but the dates may not be in order. So it just depends how the bank or the institution is formatting the data. So we're going to go back to QuickBooks. Now, if we were writing checks, this would be a very useful system because the next check should always be the next check if we were writing the checks from the system. So we're going to say that this is going to be Gibson. So I'm going to type in Gibson, hoping I'm spelling this correctly. And again, if we don't know who the vendor is, we can always research it, Google it, get some idea. And the more we have an idea of what's going on, we can then go to the client and vendor and say, hey, this is what I think it is. And we can, show that we're doing some due diligence here and enter in the data. So we're going to say tab. We're going to do a quick add, set it up as a vendor. It's going to be a vendor and say, okay, that's going to be for 500. And again, uncategorized expense. So I'm just going to type that in and it'll auto populate. Now we could, of course, hit the drop down and find it, or we could just start typing in uncategorized and see that that's it and set tab. Again, we could put a memo trying to tell ourselves what we think it is, but I'm just going to keep it as is for now and go forward. Next item we got, we're going to say highlight that. That has been input, so I'm going to highlight it. Safe Insurance Company. So we've got the Safe Insurance Company. Now notice here it's for 12,000. So again, we might have a question on that. That's kind of a lot compared to the others. So we have some options with the insurance, like what exactly do we want to do with that? And we can think about how we want to input that into the system. So it's another one where I'm going to write a note on this. And the questions we could have here is what are the terms of this policy? It looks like an insurance policy, so we could just put it to insurance expense, but the 12,000 looks like a lot compared to the other numbers here. So maybe it's not just for 1 month. And if we're paying insurance for multiple months, then we have a question as to whether we want to expense it now or if we want to use some other kind of format to enter this into the system. So if we just wanted to push forward with a complete cash basis, we can just enter it into the system, 12,000 insurance expense, just a generic insurance expense, and leave it at that. However, if we're considering doing a little bit more in terms of an accrual type of system for insurance, for example, if they're paying 12,000 for a year, then it would kind of distort our numbers if we enter it just as an expense. So note, if we want to do the simplest thing, we could just enter it as an expense. If we want to do something else, we can examine our other options. And that's what we'll do. So we'll go back to some of these items and examine the different options we have for something like insurance and why whenever you see insurance, you kind of want to think about these things. If it's a small amount, probably means they're paying monthly, then we could probably just expense it, no big deal. If it's a larger amount, probably means they're not just paying monthly. We might want to consider if we want to take into account different options. We'll discuss those at a later time. For now, we're just going to push forward and say I'm going to go with insurance expense at the 8th check number. That's the correct check number. We're going to put Safe Insurance company, quick add, set it up as a vendor. We're going to put 12,000, and again I'm going to put it into uncategorized expense until we figure out what we want to do with that. Next item that we're going to have, I'm going to highlight that information, is Staples office supplies, 400. Now Staples is usually just a store for office supplies. So that one seems fairly straightforward. 400 is not too much. So we're probably just going to say, I'm just going to expense the office supplies. So we're just going to say on the 10th, that's the correct check number. We're going to say Staples office supplies tab. Again, I'm creating a new vendor every time because we don't have these vendors. Once we do this in the second month, then these vendors will be there. I won't have to type in the vendor. So typically, we would want to search and see if there is a vendor, and by typing it in, that will help us to do that. If there was a vendor, it would auto-populate typically. We'll say quick add, vendor. We're going to say that Staples, we paid them 400. And I'm going to look for something now and see where I want to put this. And I'm thinking something like office supplies. So here's office supplies. That seems reasonable. So I'm just going to look for whatever expense because these are the standard expenses that we have. And I would assume that most of the stuff that we have could fit into a generic category for business expenses. And this one, office supplies, looks good. So we're going to say, and we could if we think office supplies, I would start typing it in there, see if it auto-populates. If it doesn't, then I'm going to try something else and look through the list because I don't want to make up a new account unless I think it's appropriate. I want to use whatever accounts there because the defaults by QuickBooks are accounts that are industry standards. So I want to use industry standards unless I want more detail for whatever reason for this particular client. So we're going to say tab, and that one we finally get to enter one that's not not a question for us. We'll go back here and say that that one has been entered. Right click and highlight. Edison Electric. So okay. Now that one, we can be fairly, Edison, if we look that up, it's the electric company. So that's a utilities typically that we can put that in, be fairly confident on that. It looks like a reasonable, bill amount. So it doesn't look like it's out of the realm of a utilities bill. So I'm going to say, okay, that one's just going to be Edison. Now note, I could try to find the vendor here. Here's our vendors we have so far. But we're just making the vendors as we go. We're not entering vendors before we start this process. We don't need to enter all the people that are vendors before we start entering. We just enter the vendors as we go. In the first month of operations, then, of course, we will be entering a lot of vendors. In the second month, we'll be entering far fewer vendors. And as we go forward, the entering of vendors should decrease substantially. So we're going to say then here, this is Edison Electric. And we're going to say tab and quick add Edison vendor. That's what we want. And Edison's going to be for $598. And this would be, I would assume this would be something like utilities that we're going to pay here. So if we select the drop down, we would think Edison is, whatever the utility company is, it might be, this place utility or that place utility or whatever utility it is. And so we could break it out. You might think, hey, that's electric versus phone, that you might think that I want to put it into the electric bill or something. And you could do that, but it might be easier just to use whatever QuickBooks standards are, because when you talk to the tax person and other people, they're probably thinking of more of a standardized list, and you want to just be on the same wavelength as the people you're going to be dealing with from a professional standpoint. So we're going to go through here and say, what could I do with this? Utilities. That's probably the standard. So I'm going to say utilities, type it in there. There it is. Tab, enter. Got that one. So we're going to highlight that and right click and highlight. Next one is Office Depot. So Office Depot. Now this one, it looks like 9,000, looks kind of a lot again. So that looks like a lot that was purchased at Office Depot. So we might have to question that and think, well, that doesn't look like office. So I don't think I can write off just 9,000 or as just office supplies. It looks like they didn't just buy, Post-it notes here. So we're going to have to ask on that one probably. So we'll probably write a note on that one. So our note might look something like this, Office Depot, check number 1008. On this date, you purchased something for 9,000. There's a check for 9,000. Doesn't seem like normal office supplies. What was purchased? My guess would be that it was some kind of office equipment, like a large printer or something, some kind of, or multiple, some kind of large piece of equipment. And if you have a large piece of equipment or a big purchase item like that, it's possible that they financed part of it. So if you ever see like someone purchased like a forklift or something like that, then they may put a fairly substantial down payment and finance some of it as well. So that's another question you may want to ask. And once we get that information, we'll then categorize this appropriately. So I would assume it'd be some kind of office equipment. We'll talk more about it though. So for now, I want to get more information on it. So we're going to put this into the 13th, and we're going to say the check number is 1008. Notice the check number is not going in order. It's 1008 because we're not writing the checks from the system, in which case it would go in order. We're getting these from the bank. And so whenever they cleared, that's when we're getting them. So we don't really have that check that we would have if we were to write the checks from the system and then double check them to the bank of the check numbers being in order in that fashion. So just be aware of that. And we're going to say that this is going to go to Office Depot. So we're going to say Office Depot. It's a new vendor because it's the beginning of the month and we don't have these vendors in there. We're going to say Quick Add and Vendor, and we're going to say 9,000. Now note that this is because it's the first month that this company has. They might be purchasing stuff. They might have taken a loan and they have to make substantial purchases in order to start the business, to use the capital to get the business going. So if this was the first month of operations or close to it, we might have fairly substantial, unusual transactions like loans to the business, like owners putting more money into the business, like making large capital purchases that will be lasting for a long period of time. If we're taking on a client that already is in process or has a client that doesn't have a lot of startup costs, then we won't have this kind of unusual thing at the first start that we take on the client. Things should be fairly normal and throughout the process. So just be aware of that. If it's a new company, of course, we're going to have activity in the first few months of operation that will be unusual, and then we'll start to hit a flow that's pretty normal. And that unusual stuff will be large purchases of equipment that we need to get going and any kind of capital investments that we need to fund those large purchases we need to get going typically. Okay, so then this is going to go into uncategorized again. We don't know where that's going to go, uncategorized. We might want to wager a guess here in the memo, like I think this is equipment, but I won't do that for now. We're going to keep going. It's in our notes. So then we're going to say the next item here, Vanguard Investments. So Vanguard Investments, and again, we might not know Vanguard but you could Google Vanguard Investments, and you'll probably find that it's an investment company like we could invest in something like stocks and bonds. So this looks like they have some of their investments that they put into basically stocks and bonds, and so that's unusual. So what do we want? So we want to double check on that because that's a large dollar amount, and we can guess what happened there. And if it is in stocks and bonds, it's kind of unusual. We want to know how we're gonna deal with that on our side. So we're gonna write a note for that one. So we're just gonna write this down: Vanguard Investments for 114 for 15,000, and I'm gonna guess this is an investment for stocks and bonds. And if it is, then we'll have to think about how to deal with that. Now, if we're dealing with a small company, that's kind of unusual because the stock and bonds investments you would think wouldn't be within the company, it would be outside of the company. But it is possible for a company or a business, the sole proprietor business, to put money into stocks and bonds for a temporary amount of time. So you may want to ask that, like, why is it in the stocks and bonds? That's not really our business as the bookkeeper, because we're going to separate what we do from advice from, say, a CPA firm or something like that. But if it's for long-term investments, you would think it wouldn't be within the business part of the sole proprietor, but in the personal side. They should pull it out as a draw if they don't need the money for investments and put it into stocks and bonds on the personal side. However, if it's on the business side and it's temporarily being held because they're going to make a larger purchase at some point, they want to keep it within the business side of things so that they can make an investment soon, that would seem more appropriate. Again, that gets into like advice and things like that, but I just want to point that out for two reasons. One, small companies, you probably won't see a lot of the investments on that side. And two, if you do see that, then there's probably a specific reason, and we'll have to think about how we want to deal with it, and that's going to be something we'll have to put on the books basically as an asset. So we'll go back and we'll take a look at that item. So we're going to go back to QuickBooks. We're going to enter that into our system on the 14th. It's going to be check number 1010, and then we'll put this in here for Vanguard. Hopefully I spelled that right. Investments. Vanguard Investments. And tab, gonna go quick add vendor, and we'll put that in for 15,000. And again, I don't know, I'm gonna put uncategorized expense because we're gonna have to go back in there and figure that out. I'm assuming it's some kind of if it's stocks and bonds, we're gonna have to put it on as an asset, as like investments or something like that. So we're gonna stop there for now, and we will continue with this on the next presentation. For more accounting information and accounting courses, visit our website at accountinginstruction.info.